Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to another edition of the ICommunicate MindsetGo radio show. I'm your host, Mark Altman. Happy to be back with you on this Thursday afternoon. And we're going to continue our conversation, pick up right where we left off last week, talking about trust. Got a lot of positive feedback from our listeners and how much that helped them in their job, and whether they're in leadership or sales or even in their daily life. So thanks again for joining us. And being here in New England, we're going to start with a phrase that I think many people are familiar with, and certainly Patriots fans, and it's the phrase, "In Bill we trust." But we blindly trust him. And if Bill says this is the guy, or this is the right free agent pickup, or this is the right trade, with many other general managers or coaches, we would question it. But because of his pattern and track record of proof of precedent setting, we tend to blindly trust. And this is actually referred to as a term called captainitis. And the term captainitis first came from it basically means your team members blindly deferring to a boss regardless of what they think. So you could engage in healthy dialogue. You could receive a different perspective, ideas, thoughts from your team members. But captainitis is blindly trusting because of their authority or their precedent. Now, this term came from some airplane crashes where crew members knew that the captain was making a wrong-headed decision, and they exhibited passivity and didn't really speak up and didn't advocate for themselves, even though they knew it was the wrong thing to do. And in a handful of cases, this resulted in a plane crash. So this concept of captainitis, whether it's with a leader, an airplane captain, a coach, or general manager in sports, it's a real thing, and it happens all the time. And that's why when we talk about leadership skills and emotional intelligence, we often talk about the ability to advocate for yourself and knowing when are those opportunities that you can feel safe and comfortable speaking up. Now, one of the interesting things about leadership is the concept of influence. And with influence, there's something I've done quite a lot of research on called Cialdini's 6 Principles of Influence. And one of them is using authority. And the best leaders are the ones that use authority without actually being in authority. And one of the best expressions I've ever been told was actually from my high school accounting teacher, who once told the class, he said, "Don't confuse kindness with weakness." And that phrase has always stuck with me, because I think when people are in authority, when they start exhibiting characteristics such as empathy, self-awareness, self-regulation, all fundamental characteristics of emotional intelligence, they think that makes them look weak. And you hear the words respect thrown around when it comes to authority, and you've got to earn respect. You don't command respect. We hear that all the time. But when you think about someone you report to, for our listeners out there today, and think of the things that, qualities and characteristics that make you respect and authority, think about your core values. Think about the perceptions and feelings you have about authority at work. And whether it's micromanaging, whether it's being intimidating, whether it's using guilt, whatever those things are that help you as a leader command authority, emotional intelligence is the opposite of that. And what Cialdini talks about in his principle of influence is, how can you be a trusted expert? How can you earn the trust while being in authority without showing those authoritative traits? So what I thought we would build on today from last week and getting into the show is, whenever I ask someone, how do you prove trust? People look at me as if I have 3 heads, because that's a really hard thing to do. Usually we build trust based on long-term relationships, experiences we have with the other person. If it's in a company situation, it would be customer experiences we have with that company. And the whole concept of writing a testimonial or doing a video testimonial is, do you trust that person or that company? Are they credible enough to warrant you advocating and speaking out on their behalf? And one of the colleagues that I work with and do some coaching for, he owns a video production company, and he does great work around video testimonials. But one of the things I always tell him is part of the reason why people are hesitant to make a video testimonial is not because they don't trust the company and not because they don't want to do something nice. It's because they're not confident enough to know how to put their words together and articulate and advocate for that company. So today I thought we would talk about some key elements of trust. And the first one we're going to start with is open communication. Now that's a big word. That's a big phrase, I should say. It's a big expression. And when it comes to open communication, it could mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And we've talked on past shows about words or phrases that are open to interpretation. So when I think of open communication, I'm thinking of something at a very high level. And it all starts with a phrase you're all familiar with called the open door policy. And the open door policy, I think if you survey 100 people and ask them what they associate with the open door policy, they will answer that it's a leader or a boss that has his door or her door open in their office so you feel comfortable and they're available. They have the time to come in and talk with you or for you to come in and talk with them. The tricky thing about the open door policy is, to me, there's a big misconception because that doesn't create open communication. The concept of an open door policy is that the leader has allegedly created a culture, created an environment where you feel comfortable, safe that by coming into that open door, by coming into that office, it will be worthwhile because that leader in turn will receive your feedback. They might hopefully will act on your feedback if possible. And so to me, the highest level you can get for open communication is initiating feedback. Now, take a step back for a moment. How many of you out there that have a significant other of some kind would go home tonight and say to your significant other, geez, honey, I've been thinking, how could I be a better husband, boyfriend, girlfriend, wife, what have you? You would never do. Most people wouldn't even consider doing that. As a matter of fact, when I bring that up in our corporate trainings, a lot of the times the answer I get is a big chuckle like, oh, I would never do that. And part of the reason why people are very hesitant to initiate feedback is because when you do, there's a fear that the person receiving the feedback will hold a grudge, will react poorly, it'll feel like a waste of time. So having the confidence and courage to initiate feedback is very rare. So in the workplace, I hear a lot of leaders telling me, oh no, my team comes and gives me feedback. But I'm actually talking about unsolicited feedback. For example, let's say you run a meeting and at the end of the meeting, someone feels comfortable to come up to you as a leader and say, geez, Bill, I've been thinking, I've watched you run a few meetings, and I thought it would be worthwhile to make the meetings more engaging and effective if you tried the following 1, 2, or 3 scenarios. That is very, very rare because when a person's in a position of authority, to question their approach, their strategy, their process is risky. So as a leader, when I talk about open communication, if you've created a culture where people are coming up and giving you an unsolicited feedback, that to me is the ultimate in open communication. And a final thought on this before we go to our first break, when it comes to initiating feedback, here are the characteristics that make that alleged open door policy or that open communication stick. One is loyalty. So do people keep their word? Do they honor what they say? Are they going to follow through with what they commit to? 2, are they not going to judge? Are they going to seek to actually understand without judgment? And that's big because we know how body language and communication can really define people's comfort level, what you say, how you say it in terms of how comfortable they are in sharing information. And, in conjunction with that is laughing with someone, not at someone, because, again, no one wants to risk being made fun of or feeling stupid. And lastly is, if you have an issue or a concern, you're talking directly with the source. If you're giving feedback to a leader and you've already gone to a couple of people to complain, before you're initiating that feedback to the leader's already going to have their defenses up in frustration. So there's a commitment on your part. It's a two-way street, as communication always is, that are you going first to the source to try to resolve this issue so there can be that open communication and initiating feedback. So when we talk about elements of trust, we've just covered the first one, but there's some really key elements, and as you're listening today, think about if you're doing those things. If you are a leader, are you doing those things? And if you're someone who reports, which most of us are, to a leader, think about those characteristics that you're demonstrating and that hopefully the leader is demonstrating. So we're going to go to our first break. This is the Mindset Go radio show. I'm your host, Mark Altman, and we'll be back after the break. Welcome back to the Mindset Go radio show. Hope you're having a great Thursday afternoon. Really happy to be here, and love this topic of trust, because when we talk about things in the workplace like influence, persuasion, leadership, it all comes down, every relationship comes down to trust. And when I think of all the things that can degrade or lessen a relationship, once you lose trust and once you don't trust that fellow man or woman, it really impacts your ability, A, to be emotionally intelligent in that relationship, but B, to do all the things you need to do in the workplace, is be productive, be collaborative, actively listening, because once you start to doubt the other person, it impacts all of those things. So the second element of trust that's really important is being consistent. And when it comes to consistency, what I find interesting about that is part of being emotionally intelligent is being mindful and being self-aware and being able to regulate your emotions and feelings so you can establish that consistency. And a lot of times what happens is, and look, none of us are perfect, we're all flawed, but what it comes down to is if there's every 4 scenarios you have an opportunity to follow through and be consistent, and you follow through on 2 or 3 of them, then it's the 1 or 2 that you don't follow through that people are going to pay more attention to. For example, there have been a lot of studies done that for every negative comment or piece of criticism in life, you need 7 positives for someone to cancel out the negative because they're so focused and honed in on the negative. So here are some questions I always ask leaders when it comes to being consistent. How committed are you to keeping your obligations? And what does that mean, how committed? I mean, are you consistent? If you say you're going to do something, do you actually do it? All of the time, most of the time, some of the time, or rarely? I think of things, what are your choices for your employees to hold them accountable for their commitments? So if they're not keeping their commitments, I have clients all the time saying, I give our staff things to do and they don't do it, and I don't really have the time to check over everything, and then because I'm not checking and following up, the work never gets done. Well, to me, that's why I'm always emphasizing one of the core values at Mindset Go is developing processes and having a focus on that to lead to commitments. So if people don't know how to do something, if they don't know how to be organized, if they don't know how to be efficient, if they don't know how to collaborate effectively, then that's going to hinder their ability to keep commitments, because the knowledge is just as important as the skills. And then what happens when circumstances come up that interfere with people keeping their commitments? Then there becomes that doubt, right? And doubt and uncertainty start to creep in. And when it comes to trust, we've done some shows in the past on accountability and excuses just make people look weak. And I'll get some of our clients come to me and they'll say, well, but sometimes it's a real excuse. Sometimes it's a family emergency or it's a weather emergency. Look, again, it comes down to track record and precedent. If you're the kind of person that has a habit of making excuses, then even when it is a legitimate emergency, you're probably still going to be questioned fairly or unfairly. But the fact of the matter is you're going to have situations come up and obstacles that interfere with your ability to make commitments. When they do, how frequently do they happen, and how do you handle them when they do happen? And lastly, forgiveness. I think when it comes to consistency, is there a forgiveness when people make those mistakes? Is there an ability to forgive? And do you feel like you're going to be isolated or cast aside when you make that mistake that possibly loses a client for your company, that possibly creates a rift in a relationship? And that's a key element. And look, if I were to call up an HR person or a CEO today and say, hey, look, I'd like to conduct a workshop on forgiveness, I'd probably get laughed out the door, because so much of forgiveness is internal as much as external. So they're going to sit there and hear that, and they're going to say, well, what are we going to get out of this if we invest in this forgiveness training? And the fact of the matter is it's really emotional intelligence training, and what you get out of it is two huge elements of workplace success. One is you get a more engaged team, and two, you get a more collaborative culture. And so when it comes to forgiveness, you have to look at higher level. That is one of the fundamental elements that what creates rifts in relationships. And that brings me to one of my favorite topics. And, we recently did a training at beautiful O'Neill Cinemas in Littleton. If you have not been there, it's a wonderful place. And during that training, one of the participants in the training talked about trusting her gut and knowing that we've spent so much time last week on the show and in the first segment of today's show talking about trusting others. But now we're going to shift a little bit to trusting inward and trusting your gut. And one of the challenges in trusting your gut is when you make a decision, trusting your gut directly correlates with decision making and critical thinking. Okay? So every time you make a decision, even if you've received feedback from others, you ultimately have something in your gut that's saying, okay, this is the right thing to do. So when you make decisions and critical think to lead to those decisions and they don't work out, the tendency is to say, oh, why did I do that? Or why did I trust my gut? And then people get really out of whack because then they start to second guess every decision they make, and they don't necessarily know when it's okay to trust your gut, when it isn't. But what I explained to this woman, and she was very intelligent and successful, is I said, when you're questioning whether you're trusting your gut, it's not, the answer isn't to question, do you have a good gut? The answer is to question the decision-making process and the critical thinking process that's leading up to making those decisions. And are you evaluating the right criteria? Are you talking to the right people? Those are the things you should be thinking about, among others. But when it comes to trusting your gut, we so want to believe people, even when they know what they're offering is too good to be true. So, one of them is your own decision-making, and one of them is that captainitis I referred to earlier in the show. So if you are being led by someone in your team, heck, if it's your spouse even, or a C-suite executive you work with, to question someone, even if in your gut you know this is the right decision, if you're not speaking up, think about that for a moment. What are the consequences of not speaking up? Well, as you're listening to the show, I'm sure one of the consequences is the obvious one, is that if mistakes are made when they could have been prevented, then there's going to be obvious impact to the company's bottom line, to client retention, perhaps to employee retention. I mean, there's some really obvious things, but it goes deeper than that. You are starting to create a pattern for yourself where you're questioning whether you should speak up, and every time you question it and don't speak up, it gets harder. As that habit becomes more entrenched, it becomes harder and harder to get the confidence and courage to speak up. And so it creates an internal problem as well as an external problem. But I don't think we usually give a lot of weight to the internal damage it does on ourselves. And one of my favorite topics to teach at MindsetGo is multi-generational intelligence and multi-generational communication. And what I often hear from younger generations in the workplace is they don't speak up because they don't really feel like their feedback or opinion will be valued. And so I push back and I say, well, what would happen to make your feedback and opinion feel valued where you could change your mind? And they say, well, we just don't want to be demeaned because of our age or inexperience and so on and so forth. But the fact of the matter is, part of being an effective leader, whether it's a younger generation or your generation, is to create that culture where the feedback is valued and you can trust you will be heard. And a lot of people, when they give feedback, part of the rules and expectations they establish is they expect immediate results from the feedback. And sometimes it takes people a long time to process that feedback, and it can even take months and sometimes even years to act on the feedback. But if we don't get that instant gratification on that feedback, it feels like, well, why bother? So that's the first thing. And then the second thing goes the other direction, where if you do speak up and your opinions and thoughts aren't validated or acknowledged, and by the way, there's two parts to that. They can be validated or acknowledged in a meeting, or they can also be validated and acknowledged by following up with that person. And even if you don't embrace their idea or opinion, for you to follow up and say, hey, listen, thanks for speaking up in the meeting the other day. Whether we accept your opinion or not, we really appreciate your input and feedback. We're not going to move forward with it, but please keep it coming. That's what people need to hear. And I don't care how old you are. If you're trying to create a culture where people trust that their feedback and input is worthwhile, that's what it takes. I remember with my old company, one of the things, the culture I tried to create is we'll take feedback from the janitor. And I'm not trying to demean janitors. Janitors do great work and we need them. My point is that whether you're a fifth grader, whether you're a janitor, whatever your role is in society, you have a brain and in some way you have an experience that can probably lend wisdom to a situation. And that is the kind of culture leadership should be creating, is that when you are creating a culture where people's feedback is valued, those ideas start to flow, and it also creates a more engaged and active culture. So when we come back from our second break, we're going to continue the culture on the conversation on trusting your gut, and more discussion on a secret formula so you can know if someone truly is trustworthy. This is Mark Altman with the Mindset Go radio show. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Mindset Go radio show. I'm your host, Mark Altman, and just to let you know, on our website, we are on the verge of launching our new website, but on our website, if you'd like to follow us, we do seminars, webinars. We have public speaking engagements and training programs. Please come to MindsetGo.com, sign up for our newsletter to find out more about upcoming events, and certainly follow us on social media. We have a very active presence on LinkedIn, and we'd love to hear from you. So please, if you like what you're hearing on this radio show, let us know, give feedback, and keep abreast of what we're doing. So as we get into our third segment, I just wanted to kind of continue briefly what we were talking about right before the break. And, the final point I wanted to make about feedback is, look, we talk about the bottom line. Companies for so long talk about the bottom line. What is the revenue? What are the end results we're looking for? And, what goes with that bottom line is companies start from the bottom up, and that feedback. Look, who is the first line of defense typically at a company? It's usually some kind of receptionist or some kind of admin of some kind. And they are really interacting not only with everybody in the company, but in many cases, they're interacting with most, if not all, the clients. So who really is in a better position to give pulse of what's going on with employees, clients, leaders? And I think what's interesting is when I look at feedback as a whole, it's one, again, I talked about it earlier, initiating the feedback. Once a week, can you be mindful enough as a leader to walk up to the different people at what you perceive the lower levels are of the company and simply ask them, have you noticed anything? Have you observed anything? Have you heard or seen anything that would be valuable for me to know about the company, about the employees, and about the clients? And one of these expressions that I really resent is this expression, and I hear it all the time. It's called work smarter and not harder. And the reason why I resent it is because when you work smarter, you're still working harder, right? Because the implication of the phrase work smarter is that you have to do something different than you're already doing. And when salespeople or leadership hear work smarter, they're like, oh yeah, I get it. I need to be more efficient. I need to have better use of my time. But what it doesn't talk about is working smarter can be so simple, little incremental changes that don't demand huge changes, that don't demand a real transition in your habits. So as a leader, if you could do one simple thing and make sure you're reaching out, ideally in person, depending on how much of your company is virtual, but if you're reaching out once a week and just walking up to people and asking those questions, it could take 10 or 15 minutes of your time a week. And I got news for everybody. Time is the enemy. We all know that, okay? But if you always use the excuse of time or frequently use the excuse of time, then nothing will ever get done. Because at some point you have to fit in things that will promote personal growth, professional growth, and development for yourself as well as your team. So I want to cover one other thing about trusting your gut, and that is charisma, persuasion, and first impressions. Okay, so many times our brain tricks us into thinking that we can trust people and trust instructions or requests because of who they're coming from. And I think there's a process that has to be taken to really know, can I trust that person? Is this, and you know what's an interesting tidbit about this is, if I was to sit down and tell people we were going to be doing persuasion training, and I've done this, I've tested this out, people get very triggered. Persuasion feels manipulative. But then if I change it to influence, people don't mind as much. It doesn't feel as salesy or manipulative. And so this concept of manipulating people and getting people to trust you, it is such a bugaboo when it comes to salespeople. And salespeople so often will do anything to describe their role differently. They won't call themselves a salesperson. They call themselves a business development person or a client services person or an account manager person because they don't want to be associated with sales because they are assumed in most cases as being manipulative and not trustworthy. You are going to burden me on my time. You are going to push me on your own agenda. And these kinds of perceptions people have really inhibit a person's ability to trust. But that's just it. Is it the title or the role that you have that's creating trust, or is it the actions and the words that you take that support that role that are really defining whether people can trust you? So I think as you're evaluating what you determine to trust other people, it's really critical that, yes, credibility is important, track record is important, but gut instinct's also important, and understanding a decision-making and critical thinking process really leads to those three components. So now, the question is, how can I really know if someone's trustworthy? If I'm standing there, if you and I are standing together, if I'm standing with your leadership team or one of the departments in your company, and we're looking at people and talking with people, and they say to me, okay, Mark, so what am I supposed to do? I get what you're saying, but now how do I know if someone's really trustworthy? Okay? Well, one of the things I think about is, does that person remind me of someone in my past? Now, that can cut both ways. But at the end of the day, when I think of trust, I think of, am I seeing signs, whether it be body language, how they react emotionally to situations, where I've had interactions with these kind of people and the results I've seen haven't been positive. So if you can relate that person to an experience you've had in your past, it doesn't mean it's the be-all, end-all, but it's a red flag for sure. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't naturally work the opposite the same way. So if you meet someone that seems really friendly, very trustworthy, exhibiting the signs that we've talked about throughout the show today, doesn't automatically mean you can trust them, but it's a good flag, just like the other way is a red flag. The second thing is, if I follow, and I want you to pay attention to the word I'm about to use. We're talking followers versus leaders. So the ability to trust someone, you're really being a follower, right? Now, in turn, that behavior could lead to a leading behavior or leadership. But following, can I trust and follow this person? Now, remember, we talked about gut instinct. So when you make the decision to follow the person, and then after you make the decision, if you get burned and you say, why did I do that? Well, why did you do it? Did you do it because the person did have a good track record and this was a fluke? Or did you do it because you were taken by emotion and you were caught up in the moment and you weren't strong enough to advocate for yourself or be assertive to make a different choice? And that's a critical thing. Because how you respond, again, this is fundamental emotional intelligence. How you respond and react to situations, if you're second-guessing yourself, understand what that root cause is of why you're second-guessing yourself. Now, if you think about it, what would be some outward signs that you could see that you wouldn't trust this person? Well, for me, some of the obvious ones, you could see that person talking about others behind their back. You could see that person not following through on their promises and commitments. You could see that person not really making the time to value your feedback. So when you see those kinds of things, does that mean you automatically don't trust them? Well, depending on the relationship, it might be worth talking to them about this. There's this expression, is it a fluke or is it a trend? When something happens one time, it could be a fluke or it could be a sign of things to come. When something happens repeatedly, it could be a trend that tells you everything you need to know, or perhaps someone's never said something to this person. And I want to just share a quick anecdote before we go into our third break, and that is I was working 3 years ago with a sixth grader. Part of what we do at MindsetGo is we talk about building confidence and skills for high school students, primarily college students, and sometimes middle school students. So this sixth grader, I posed the question to the group, and I said, give me an example of a teacher that you don't like, not because you necessarily think they're mean or you have a personality conflict with them, but a teacher you don't like because you think they're not an effective teacher and something you could give them some constructive feedback. So this child, a great kid, but was very introverted and not all that confident. And so we talked through an actual conversation intelligence template where he actually had a very simple format where he could go in and talk to this teacher. His complaint, to be succinct, was that the teacher, when she put notes on the board, would erase the notes too quickly before he could write them all down. And he was very frustrated. So he goes up to the teacher and he says, I forget her name. Let's say it's Mrs. Jones. Mrs. Jones, I just wanted to bring up, if it's okay, that I noticed that, you erased the notes too quickly. I mean, he was practically shaking as he retold me this story. And her response was, oh, I didn't even know that. I'll make sure I don't do that in the future. Now, in that case, he was heard and validated. My point is, very often when we lose faith and trust in people, no one's ever spoken up. They don't have the self-awareness to even realize they're doing these bad habits and trends they are. So at some point, someone has to speak up, not to guarantee results, but to hopefully create the behavior change. So it's important to remember in a trust situation, sometimes that self-awareness piece is really lacking, and you could be the one to reverse that trend by creating the self-awareness for that person. So we're going to go into our final break. This is Mark Altman for the MindsetGo Radio Show. When we come back, we'll finish our final segment on trust, and please stay with us. We'll be right back. Okay, we're back. Final segment of our second show on trust, and hope you're getting a lot out of this and able to apply some of these strategies and suggestions to the workplace and share them with some of your coworkers. So we're going to finish the show today by talking about some actions you can take if you find yourself not believing in your leader and you still want to succeed. And as I just said going into the break, there's conversations you can have, assuming that there is a culture for initiating unsolicited feedback. So look, if you feel like you don't know how to make the right decisions and trusting the wrong people, and you know where we see this the most is personal relationships. We see so much divorce, we see so much breakup. So, of course, once you go through that a few times, there's a tendency to go, I don't even know who to trust because I keep making the wrong decisions. So look, like everything else, when it comes to a trust issue, period, the key is to slow down. I mentioned a few minutes ago that time issue is always our enemy, right? The commodity of time. So slow down, do a balanced and unemotional assessment of the person. And ask for trusted input from other people that know this person. The problem is, I do believe in asking for trusted input. Problem is, if these people have an agenda or have certain experience, it can really taint the feedback you get from this person. So one of the pieces of advice I give to leadership all the time is, when you're seeking advice from someone else, if this person has an experience with the situation or the person, the first question before you ask feedback to someone should say is, what has been your experience with this person? Or what has been your experience with this situation? And always start with that. It's really important because to get balanced and non-influence feedback, you have to know their template and where they're coming from. Secondly, is we really have to look at part of trusting is knowing our template from our childhood. When you look at, I call it internal guidance, and when you look at the impact your parents made on you, did they discourage speaking up? Did they not really give you feedback very often? Were they not ones you could sit down with and have intimate conversations about things that were bothering you or frustrating you? If you have a mother or father or both that fit that criteria, that could very much be tainting and affecting your ability to see people clearly. And you could be mirroring your experiences from your parents or influencers or family members or mentors when you were younger, and that could be clouding your viewpoint. But look, here are some basic actions you can take if you're really finding yourself having trouble trusting people. Think about your own purpose and core values. What are the things that matter most when you're forming relationships with other people? How do you connect? Don't let it get personal. You have to take emotion out of the equation. The irony about emotional intelligence is it's so appropriately named, but people get so triggered by the words of emotions, they start thinking it's going to be Dr. Phil or some kind of earthy, crunchy psychological method. But the fact is, emotional intelligence teaches you not to get emotional. That's the idea. Not to suppress your emotions, not to internalize your emotions. It helps you address and cope with your emotions. And that's really important. And look, we all have opportunities to take control. When people say they're busy because they're making decisions and choices with their time. That's why they're busy. You are in control of how you feel. You are in control of the thoughts, the ideas, the feelings you have. So there's opportunities when you take control. But when it comes to trust, if you're letting other people define your ability to trust, then you don't have control and haven't maintained control. Practicing empathy, that's such a fundamentally important thing. The problem is people think practicing empathy is relating to them and putting them in their shoes and that being the end of the discussion. But the fact of the matter is empathy is like listening. It's an ongoing thing. It's not something to check off your list and say, I got it over with and I was empathetic with that person. It's seeking ways to be empathetic throughout the conversation. And one of the things I impress at MindsetGo when we coach and train on is something we call conversational intelligence. And some of the fundamental aspects to being conversationally intelligent are listening without an agenda, listening without wanting to argue or defend, being effortlessly empathetic, managing your body language so you can anticipate and understand reactions. Those are three of the fundamental things in emotional intelligence. So you have got to control. If your leader isn't the kind of person you want to be, heck, if your team isn't the kind of team you want to be around, know what you can control, know the kind of conversations you can have. Secondly is the word standards. This is a really big word for I think, corporate America. It's standards. We all seem to have different standards and expectations. But do you know what your standards are? Have you ever articulated to yourself or others what your standards are in the workplace? Because part of what happens is there are so many unspoken expectations in the workplace that where a lot of relationships break down is those unspoken expectations put a lot of stress and pressure on people. And because of those expectations and because standards and core values are so different and never discussed, that's where they break down. So I'm advocating for you to take 10 or 15 minutes, sit down at your desk and say, look, if people were going to work for me, what would I demand of them? What would my standards and expectations be? Because that ties into empathy. If you can articulate those internally and externally, you're likely to be more empathetic and understanding of the expectations your leaders have and then the pressures they face as well. So that's another critical thing. And last but not least, I'm going to finish the word leader. Lead from where you are. Every single one of us is a leader and has the opportunity to lead where your own way. You don't need the title. Modeling behavior is leadership. It can be as simple and benign as opening the door for someone, that you're modeling that. Whenever I I talk to elderly people in the supermarket, my kids always think I'm weird for making an effort to But I'm trying to model a behavior that I want other people to follow, whether I have the word leader in my title or not. So lead from where you are, really value that. And look, these are all incremental steps you can take. So I hope you've really gotten a lot out of these 2 shows on trust. This is Mark Altman, your host, and we will be back next week for another edition of the MindsetGo radio show, where we talk about emotional intelligence in salespeople. We'll see you next week. Have a great afternoon.